You are 6 weeks old. You cannot speak, cannot walk, can barely focus your eyes on the face of the woman holding you. Your mother handed you to her 3 days ago, outside a railway station in Reading, Berkshire. Your mother was crying. She promised she would come back for you. She paid the woman £5, everything she had, and the woman smiled kindly and told her not to worry, that you would be well cared for, that adoption into a good family was certain. Your mother believed her. Why wouldn't she? The woman seemed respectable, middle-aged, well-dressed, calling herself a nurse. She had papers, references, an address in a nice neighborhood. She took you gently, cooing soft words, and your mother walked away, heartbroken but believing she had done the right thing, the only thing possible for an unmarried woman with an illegitimate child in Victorian England. That was 3 days ago. Today, the woman who calls herself Nurse Amelia Dyer wraps a white tape around your neck. She pulls it tight. You struggle briefly, your tiny body convulsing, but you are 6 weeks old and you weigh less than 4 kilograms, and within 2 minutes, you are dead. She wraps your body in cloth, ties it with string, weighs it down with a brick, and that evening she drops the package into the River Thames. You are not the first. You will not be the last. Over the next 30 years, Amelia Dyer will murder approximately 400 babies. She will be paid by desperate mothers to care for their children, and she will kill them instead, pocketing the money and disposing of the bodies. She will do this for 3 decades, moving from town to town, changing her name, evading suspicion and continuing to kill. And she will almost get away with it. This is not ancient history. This is not medieval barbarism. This happened in Britain in the late 19th century, in the reign of Queen Victoria, in an era we associate with progress and civilization. This is the story of Britain's most prolific serial killer, a woman who turned infanticide into a profitable business and the system that enabled her for 30 years. This is not fiction. This really happened. Amelia Dyer was arrested in 1896 and tried at the Old Bailey. Court records, police reports, and newspaper coverage from the time document her crimes in detail. When police dredged the Thames near Reading, they recovered the bodies of multiple infants, all bearing the same method of killing, all wrapped in parcels that were traced back to Dyer through fragments of paper and distinctive tape. Forensic examination confirmed that the babies had been strangled. Testimony from mothers who had handed their children to Dyer, believing them destined for adoption, revealed a pattern spanning decades. Dyer herself eventually confessed, though the full extent of her crimes was never completely established, because many bodies were never found and many mothers never came forward, either because they did not know their children were dead or because admitting they had given up an illegitimate child carried social stigma they could not bear. Historians estimate the number of victims at between 200 and 400, making Amelia Dyer one of the most prolific serial killers in recorded history. Yet her name is largely unknown outside academic circles specializing in Victorian crime. She operated not through exotic methods or dramatic violence, but through exploitation of a system that created vulnerable victims and looked the other way. She was enabled by poverty, by shame, by laws that punished women for pregnancy outside marriage, and by a society that preferred not to ask too many questions about what happened to illegitimate children as long as they disappeared quietly. The practice Amelia Dyer engaged in was called baby farming. The term itself is chilling, reducing infants to agricultural products, but it accurately described what occurred. Baby farming emerged in Britain in the mid-19th century as industrialization and urbanization created new social pressures. Young women migrated from rural areas to cities for work, often as domestic servants. They lived in their employers' homes, under strict supervision with little freedom and no privacy. If a servant became pregnant, whether through consensual relationship, coercion, or rape, she faced immediate dismissal. Victorian morality offered no sympathy for unmarried mothers. The child was illegitimate, a stain on family honor, proof of moral failing. The mother could not work while caring for an infant and could not find work while visibly pregnant or with a child in tow. Workhouses existed, but were designed to be so unpleasant that only the truly desperate would enter them voluntarily. Many women chose instead to pay someone else to care for the child, either temporarily while they found employment or permanently through informal adoption. Baby farmers advertised their services in newspapers. The advertisements were superficially respectable, offering adoption or fostering for a fee. Some baby farmers were legitimate, providing genuine care for children whose mothers could not keep them, but many were not. They operated on a simple economic calculation. A mother would pay a lump sum, typically between £5 and £20, for the baby farmer to care for the child. If the baby farmer actually cared for the child, feeding, clothing and housing it until adoption, or until the mother could reclaim it, the costs would quickly exceed the payment. But if the child died shortly after being handed over, the baby farmer kept the entire fee as profit. Some baby farmers accomplished this through neglect, providing minimal food and allowing infants to starve or succumb to disease. Others were more direct. They killed the children deliberately, ensuring a quick death that left no ongoing costs and no witnesses. Amelia Dyer was born Amelia Hobley in 1837 in the village of Pile Marsh, Bristol. Her early life was unremarkable. Her mother died when Amelia was young and she was raised by an aunt. She received basic education and trained as a corset maker, a respectable working-class trade. In 1861, at age 24, she married George Thomas. The marriage produced a daughter but was not happy. George suffered from typhus early in the marriage and never fully recovered, experiencing ongoing health problems that limited his ability to work. Amelia became the primary breadwinner. It was during this period that she learned the trade of baby farming. She trained under a woman named Ellen Dane, who took in infants for pay and, Amelia later claimed, taught her that the most profitable approach was to ensure the children did not survive long. Whether Dane actually instructed Amelia in murder or whether Amelia arrived at the method independently is unclear, but by the late 1860s, Amelia was taking in babies and killing them. Her method was consistent. She would advertise herself as a respectable married woman willing to adopt infants for a fee. Mothers, desperate and with no alternatives, would respond to the advertisements. Amelia would meet them, present herself as kind and capable, provide references that were either forged or obtained through bribes, and accept the child along with payment. Shortly after, the child would be dead. Amelia's preferred method was strangulation with white edging tape, a common household item used for trimming garments and curtains. It left minimal marks, could be done quickly, and was silent. After death, she would wrap the body in cloth or paper, weight it, and dispose of it in a river or bury it in a garden. Then she would move to a new town, place new advertisements, and repeat the process. The system that enabled Amelia Dyer was not accidental. Victorian Britain had created a perfect storm of conditions that made baby farming both necessary and nearly impossible to regulate. First, there was the stigma of illegitimacy. A child born outside marriage was legally and socially marked for life. The mother faced ostracism, unemployment, and potential lifelong poverty. The child had no legal rights to inheritance or support from the father. This stigma created enormous pressure on unmarried mothers to hide their pregnancies and dispose of the resulting children as quietly as possible. Second, there was economic desperation. Working-class women had few employment options. Domestic service was the largest source of female employment, but it required living in the employer's home under conditions that made childcare impossible. A woman with a child could not work as a servant, and without work, she could not support the child. The choice was often between starvation, the workhouse, or giving up the child. Third, there was lack of regulation. Baby farming operated in a legal grey area. Adoption was not formally regulated until the Adoption Act of 1926. Before that, informal arrangements were common and largely unmonitored. Anyone could claim to offer adoption services. There was no licensing, no inspection, no requirement to prove that children taken in were still alive or being properly cared for. Fourth, there was societal indifference. The babies who disappeared into the baby farming system were overwhelmingly illegitimate, born to poor women, often the result of sexual exploitation by employers or men of higher social class. Victorian society viewed these children as problems to be solved, not innocents to be protected. As long as they disappeared quietly, few people asked questions. This combination of stigma, desperation, lack of regulation, and indifference created an environment where someone like Amelia Dyer could operate for decades, killing hundreds of children, and face minimal risk of detection. Amelia's operations were not entirely without scrutiny. She was arrested twice before her final capture. The first arrest came in 1879, when a doctor became suspicious about the number of infant deaths associated with children in Amelia's care. She was charged with neglect, not murder, and served 6 months of hard labor. Upon release, she resumed baby farming, simply moving to a new location and using a different name. The second arrest came in 1890, when another doctor reported concerns. Again, she was charged with neglect. not murder. She served another short sentence. These arrests reveal a critical failure in the system. Authorities suspected something was wrong. Doctors were reporting patterns of infant deaths, but the legal framework treated these deaths as neglect, a minor offense, rather than investigating whether deliberate killing was occurring. Part of this was evidentiary. Proving murder required a body and evidence of intentional killing. Many of the babies Amelia killed were never found. Their bodies decomposed in rivers or were buried in locations that were later built over or forgotten. Without bodies, without autopsies, without forensic evidence, prosecutors could only charge neglect. And neglect, while illegal, carried minimal penalties. Amelia learned from each arrest. She became more careful about disposing of bodies, more selective about which babies she accepted, more skilled at moving before suspicion could build. She used multiple aliases. Amelia Thomas, Amelia Harding, Mrs. Stewart, Mrs. Gray. She moved frequently, operating in Bristol, Reading, Cardiff, and multiple locations across southern England. She cultivated a respectable appearance, dressed well, spoke politely, and presented herself as a Christian woman doing charitable work by caring for unfortunate children. Mothers who met her saw exactly what they desperately wanted to see, a safe haven for their babies. What they could not see, what Victorian society had made almost invisible, was that handing a child to Amelia Dyer was a death sentence, quick and certain, motivated not by madness or passion, but by simple profit. By the 1890s, Amelia Dyer had perfected her system. She was living in Reading, Berkshire, operating from a house on Kensington Road with her daughter Polly, now an adult, and Polly's common-law husband, Arthur Palmer. Both were aware of what Amelia was doing. Polly assisted in meeting mothers and collecting babies. Arthur helped dispose of bodies. This was a family business, multi-generational participation in serial murder, driven by the simple economic reality that killing babies was more profitable than caring for them. The advertisements Amelia placed were carefully worded to attract the most vulnerable mothers while avoiding suspicion. A typical advertisement read, "Married couple with no family would adopt healthy child, nice country home." Terms, £15. The language was strategic. Married couple suggested respectability and stability. No family implied the child would receive individual attention. Nice country home evoked pastoral safety, appealing to urban mothers who imagined their children would be raised in clean air and open spaces, rather than the crowded, polluted cities where they worked. Terms, £15 was the transaction, high enough to suggest quality care but not so high as to be unaffordable for a desperate woman who had scraped together savings or borrowed from family. Mothers who responded would receive a kind letter, signed with whatever name Amelia was currently using, arranging a meeting at a railway station or neutral location. Amelia understood that mothers wanted to believe their children would be safe, and she gave them every reason to believe. She would arrive well-dressed, often carrying a medical bag to reinforce her claim of being a trained nurse. She would coo over the baby, praise its health and beauty, assure the mother that finding a suitable adoptive family would be easy for such a lovely child. She would provide a receipt, a scrap of paper that formalized the transaction and gave the mother something to hold on to, proof that she had done what she could. Then she would take the baby, offer final reassurances, and disappear into the crowd. Within hours, the child would be dead. The method Amelia used was brutally efficient. White edging tape, bought by the spool from any draper's shop, cost a few pennies. It was strong, flexible, and left marks that could be mistaken for the creases and discolorations common in infant bodies, especially after immersion in water. Strangulation was quick, taking only 2 to 3 minutes for an infant, and required no special tools or strength. It could be done in the privacy of her home, with no noise that would alert neighbors. After death, Amelia would wrap the body in whatever material was at hand, often old newspapers, cloth scraps, or brown paper. She tied the parcels with string and weighted them with bricks or stones. The disposal sites varied. In Reading, she frequently used the River Thames, dropping weighted parcels from bridges or riverbanks at night. She also buried bodies in gardens of houses she rented, moving before anyone thought to excavate. The volume of her operation was staggering. Police would later estimate that at the peak of her activity in the 1890s, she was killing 1 or 2 babies per week. At that rate, over a 30-year career, 400 victims is not only plausible, but potentially conservative. Each death generated pure profit. If she charged £15 per baby and killed 50 babies a year, her annual income was £750, equivalent to approximately £90,000 in today's currency. an enormous sum for a working-class woman in Victorian England. She lived comfortably, rented decent housing, dressed well, and had sufficient money to bribe officials or pay off suspicious landlords when necessary. The business model was sustainable because the supply of desperate mothers was effectively unlimited, and the risk of prosecution remained low as long as bodies were not found and mothers did not report their suspicions. But mothers did suspect. Some wrote letters asking about their children, requesting updates or photographs, wanting reassurance that the adoption had been completed. Amelia's responses were vague but reassuring. She would claim the child was thriving with its new family, that providing specific details would violate the adoptive parent's privacy, that it was better for all involved if the biological mother did not know the location to avoid future complications. Most mothers, already carrying shame and grief over giving up their children, accepted these explanations. They wanted to believe. Admitting that something might be wrong would mean confronting the possibility that they had handed their child to a murderer, a thought too unbearable to entertain. A few mothers were more persistent. They traveled to the addresses Amelia had provided, only to find she had moved or that the address had been fictitious. Some went to police, but police response was inconsistent. Without a body, without clear evidence of crime, and given the social stigma attached to illegitimacy, police often treated these complaints as civil disputes rather than criminal matters. The mothers were viewed as unreliable witnesses, women who had already demonstrated poor judgment by becoming pregnant outside marriage. Their claims that a respectable-seeming nurse might have murdered their children were treated with skepticism. This pattern of dismissal was not unique to Amelia Dyers. Victims. Victorian society systematically devalued the testimony of women, particularly working-class women, particularly women who had violated sexual norms. Their word carried less weight than that of a middle-aged woman who presented herself as charitable and respectable. This imbalance of credibility allowed Amelia to operate far longer than should have been possible, given the number of complaints and suspicious deaths associated with her. The beginning of Amelia's downfall came in March 1896, when a package was pulled from the River Thames near Reading by a bargeman. The package was waterlogged and partially decomposed, but its contents were unmistakable. The body of an infant girl wrapped in brown paper and tied with string, with a brick for weight. The paper bore a partial address that was traced to a Mrs. Thomas in Reading. Police began investigating. A second body was found days later, and then a third, all showing similar wrapping and disposal methods. The local police, now recognizing a pattern, contacted Scotland Yard. Detective Constable Anderson was assigned to the case. Anderson began by examining the wrapping materials. One piece of paper had a faint imprint that forensic analysis determined to be from a label that read, Mrs. Thomas, 26, Pigott's Road, Reading. This was one of Amelia's aliases and a house she had recently rented. Police placed the address under surveillance. On April 3, 1896, they observed Amelia leaving the house carrying a parcel. They followed her to a bridge over the Thames and watched as she dropped the parcel into the water. Police immediately arrested her. A search of the house at Pigott's Road revealed a cache of evidence. Multiple rolls of white edging tape, children's clothing that did not belong to any known child in the household, pawn tickets for baby clothes, and correspondence from mothers inquiring about their children. Most damningly, police found advertisements Amelia had placed in newspapers and replies from mothers arranging to hand over their babies. The evidence was overwhelming. Police dredged the Thames and recovered 6 more infant bodies, all wrapped and weighted in the same manner. Autopsies revealed that all had been strangled. The white tape marks were visible on the necks of the more recently deceased. Amelia Dyer was charged with murder. The trial, held at the Old Bailey in May 1896, was one of the most sensational in Victorian legal history. The courtroom was packed with spectators and journalists. Newspapers across Britain and internationally covered the proceedings in detail. The prosecution presented a methodical case. They called mothers who had given their babies to Amelia, showed correspondence proving she had taken the children in exchange for payment, and presented forensic evidence linking the recovered bodies to her residence and methods. The defense had little to work with. Amelia's solicitor attempted to argue insanity, claiming that she suffered from mental illness that rendered her incapable of understanding the nature of her actions. Medical experts were called to testify about her history, including previous suicide attempts and periods of depression, but the prosecution countered effectively. They demonstrated that Amelia's actions were methodical, calculated, and profit-driven. She had maintained multiple aliases, moved strategically to avoid detection, disposed of bodies carefully to avoid discovery, and continued her operations for 3 decades with full awareness that what she was doing was illegal and immoral. This was not madness, this was business. The jury deliberated for less than 5 minutes before returning a guilty verdict. Judge Mr. Justice Hawkins sentenced Amelia Dyer to death by hanging. She showed no emotion upon hearing the sentence. According to contemporary accounts, she accepted the verdict with apparent resignation, as if she had always known this ending was inevitable. While awaiting execution, Amelia made a partial confession. She admitted to killing multiple babies, but refused to specify a number or provide details that would allow police to locate additional bodies. Her motivations for confessing were unclear. Some historians believe she hoped that by admitting guilt for some crimes, she might protect her daughter Polly and Arthur Palmer from prosecution. Others argue she simply wanted to control the narrative, to be remembered as something other than a monster. In her confession, she claimed she had initially entered baby farming with good intentions, but had been corrupted by financial pressures and the realization that no one was monitoring what happened to the children. She portrayed herself as a victim of circumstance, forced into crime by poverty, and a society that offered no legitimate opportunities for women in her position. This self-justification was unconvincing to contemporaries and remains so to historians. Amelia Dyer was not a victim. She was a predator who identified vulnerable targets, exploited their desperation, and profited from their children's deaths. Her claim of good intentions cannot be reconciled with 30 years of systematic murder. She killed not in moments of desperation or passion, but consistently, methodically as a chosen profession. The number of victims, the duration of her crimes, and the care she took to avoid detection all indicate someone fully aware of what she was doing and committed to continuing as long as it remained profitable. On 10th June 1896, Amelia Dyer was hanged at Newgate Prison. The execution was conducted privately, as all executions had been since 1868. She was 60 years old. Her last words, according to the attending chaplain, were a prayer. She asked for God's forgiveness and expressed hope that her death would spare her daughter from prosecution. It did not. Polly Palmer and Arthur Palmer were both charged as accessories to murder. Polly received a sentence of hard labor. Arthur was acquitted due to insufficient evidence directly linking him to the killings, though he clearly had knowledge of and assisted in the disposal of bodies. The legal system, even when finally acting against Amelia, treated the crimes as primarily hers, minimizing the culpability of those who had helped her operate for years. Block 03, Palavras, 2401-3600. The immediate aftermath of Amelia Dyer's execution saw a wave of public outrage and moral panic that swept through Britain. Newspapers published extensive retrospectives on her crimes, featuring interviews with mothers who had given their children to her and never seen them again. The Times ran a series of articles examining the baby farming industry, revealing that Dyer was not an isolated case, but part of a broader pattern of exploitation and infanticide that had been operating in plain sight for decades. Other baby farmers were investigated, some prosecuted, though none approached Dyer's scale of killing. The coverage was sensational but also served a purpose. It forced Victorian society to confront uncomfortable truths about how it treated unmarried mothers and illegitimate children. The moral outrage was directed primarily at Dyer herself, portrayed as a monster of unique depravity, but more thoughtful commentators recognized that the system had enabled her. Magazines and journals published editorials arguing that as long as society punished women for pregnancies outside marriage while offering no support for raising illegitimate children, desperate mothers would continue seeking solutions from people like Amelia Dyer. Reformers called for changes to laws governing adoption, for regulation of anyone offering childcare for payment, and for greater social support for unmarried mothers. These calls for reform were partially successful, but took decades to fully implement. The Infant Life Protection Act had been passed in 1872, requiring registration of anyone taking in infants for payment, but enforcement was weak and penalties minimal. After Dyer's execution, pressure mounted to strengthen the law. The Infant Life Protection Act of 1897 expanded registration requirements and increased inspections, though loopholes remained. True comprehensive regulation would not come until the Adoption of Children Act in 1926, which finally created a legal framework for adoption that required court approval and background checks. Even then, the stigma of illegitimacy persisted well into the 20th century, creating continued vulnerability for unmarried mothers and their children. The mothers who had given their babies to Amelia Dyer faced a particular kind of hell after her crimes were revealed. Many had believed for years that their children were alive, growing up with adoptive families, possibly happy and unaware of their origins. The realization that those children had been murdered within hours or days of being handed over, that they had died terrified and alone, that their bodies had been discarded like rubbish was devastating. Some mothers came forward publicly, testifying at the trial, or speaking to newspapers, seeking some form of acknowledgement or justice. Others remained silent, unable to bear the additional shame of admitting they had been deceived or the social stigma of having given up a child in the first place. Victorian society offered these women no counseling, no support groups, no recognition of their trauma. They were expected to absorb their grief privately and move on. For many, this was impossible. Historical records contain scattered references to women who descended into depression, alcoholism, or madness after learning their children had been murdered. Some committed suicide. Most simply disappeared into the anonymity of working-class life, their stories unrecorded and their suffering unacknowledged. The children themselves left almost no trace. Most were never formally named or registered. Their births had been hidden, their deaths unrecorded, their graves unmarked or non-existent if their bodies were never recovered. When police dredged the Thames in 1896, they recovered only a fraction of Dyer's victims. The river had carried most downstream, depositing them in the estuary or the sea, or they had decomposed beyond recovery. In gardens where Dyer had lived, occasional discoveries of infant remains occurred for decades afterward, usually during construction or renovation. Small bones that were analyzed and sometimes linked to her, more often simply noted and reburied without identification. These children existed in official records only as statistics, nameless victims in a horror that Victorian society wanted to acknowledge just enough to feel appropriately outraged, but not so much as to force deep examination of the social structures that had made their murders possible. The question of how many children Amelia Dyer actually killed will never be answered with certainty. She was convicted of one murder, that of 4-month-old Doris Marmon, whose body was identified by her mother and whose death could be directly proven through forensic evidence and witness testimony. Police suspected her of at least 6 additional murders based on bodies recovered from the Thames, but the total number was far higher. During interrogation, Amelia made vague references to many babies over many years, but refused to provide specifics. Historians have attempted to calculate the number based on her known operational period, the frequency of her advertisements, witness accounts from neighbors who recalled seeing her with numerous different infants over short periods, and the rate at which mothers reported giving her children. The most conservative estimates place the number at 200. The highest credible estimates approach 600. Most historians settle on approximately 400 as a reasonable middle estimate, acknowledging massive uncertainty in either direction. What is certain is that Amelia Dyer killed more children than any other British serial killer on record, more than Jack the Ripper, more than Harold Shipman, who murdered elderly patients, more than any other individual whose crimes have been documented. The scale is difficult to comprehend. 400 babies means more than one per month for 30 years, a relentless, sustained campaign of murder that continued through changes in residence, changes in identity, arrests, imprisonments, and whatever moments of conscience or fear she may have experienced. It means 400 mothers who handed over their children believing in safety and received death. It means 400 small bodies wrapped and discarded, 400 lives ended before they truly began, 400 potential futures erased for the profit of a few pounds each. The psychological profile of Amelia Dyer has fascinated criminologists and historians. She does not fit neatly into categories of serial killers established by later research. She was not driven by sexual sadism or a need for control over victims who could resist. She did not torture or prolong death. She did not keep trophies or revisit dump sites. Her motivation appeared to be purely financial, yet the scale and duration of her crimes suggest something beyond simple greed. Most people, even desperate people, even people willing to bend or break laws, would not be capable of strangling 400 babies. The act of killing an infant, of feeling its small body struggle and then go limp, is something that provokes visceral horror in most humans. Whatever psychological mechanisms normally prevent such acts were either absent or overridden in Amelia Dyer. Some historians argue she was a psychopath, someone constitutionally incapable of empathy or emotional connection, who saw babies purely as objects to be converted into cash. Others suggest she may have begun with neglect, allowing babies to die through inadequate care, and gradually habituated to death until active killing became just another task, emotionally no different from wringing a chicken's neck. Her reported suicide attempts and periods of depression suggest she was not entirely without conscience, that the weight of her actions may have caused psychological distress, but clearly not enough to make her stop. The most disturbing possibility is that she was in most respects psychologically normal, and that the combination of economic incentive, social invisibility of her victims, and lack of consequences simply allowed latent capacity for violence that exists in many humans to express itself without restraint. The societal factors that enabled Amelia Dyer were not unique to Victorian Britain. Baby farming existed in various forms across Europe and North America during the same period. In France, similar practices were documented and prosecuted. In the United States, particularly in large cities like New York and Chicago, informal adoption services operated with minimal oversight, and scandals occasionally erupted when bodies were discovered or mothers became suspicious. The underlying causes were the same: industrial economies that demanded female labor but made childcare impossible, moral codes that punished women for sexuality outside marriage, legal systems that offered no protection or support for illegitimate children, and class structures that made poor women's testimony unreliable and their children's lives expendable. The Victorian era's reputation for progress and moral refinement coexisted with staggering levels of child mortality, exploitation, and institutional cruelty. Infant mortality rates in working-class neighborhoods routinely exceeded 50%. Children worked in factories and mines under conditions that maimed and killed them. Orphanages and workhouses had death rates that would be classified as criminal neglect by modern standards. Against this backdrop, the deaths of illegitimate infants handed to baby farmers barely registered as notable. They were already socially dead, erased from family recognition and community membership, and their physical deaths simply confirmed their social status. Amelia Dyer thrived in this environment not because she was uniquely evil, but because the system made her crimes easy, profitable, and nearly impossible to stop. The investigation that finally caught Amelia Dyer succeeded where earlier ones had failed because of incremental improvements in forensic science and policing methods. The ability to trace the wrapping materials through paper analysis, to coordinate investigations across multiple jurisdictions, to conduct systematic autopsies, and to build cases based on physical evidence rather than relying solely on witness testimony, all represented advances in criminal investigation that were relatively new in the 1890s. Earlier baby farming cases had often collapsed because prosecutors could not prove deliberate killing rather than neglect or natural death. By the time Amelia was arrested, methods existed to demonstrate strangulation, to link multiple deaths through pattern evidence, and to present forensic findings to juries in ways they could understand. Additionally, the sheer number of bodies recovered in a short period made the case undeniable. One dead baby could be explained as tragedy or accident. 7 dead babies, all killed the same way, all traced to the same woman, constituted proof of systematic murder that even Victorian juries, generally reluctant to convict respectable-appearing women of capital crimes, could not ignore. The timing was also significant. By the 1890s, public opinion about child welfare had begun to shift. Organizations like the National Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children, founded in 1884, had raised awareness about child abuse and neglect. Literature and journalism had exposed conditions in orphanages and workhouses. Middle-class reformers, many of them women newly empowered by expanding educational and professional opportunities, were advocating for children's rights and child protection laws. The Amelia Dyer case became a cause célèbre for these reformers, proof that existing systems were inadequate and that change was urgently needed. Her execution did not solve the problem of baby farming, but it created political will for reforms that gradually made such operations more difficult and less profitable. The question of Polly Palmer's culpability and her relatively light sentence compared to her mother's execution reflects both the evidence available and the gender assumptions of the juror. Polly had clearly assisted her mother, meeting with mothers, handling babies, and being present in households where murders occurred, but prosecutors could not prove she had directly killed any child or that she had full knowledge of every murder her mother committed. The defense argued that Polly was under her mother's psychological domination, that she was a victim of Amelia's influence, and that her participation was coerced, or at least not fully voluntary. This argument was more palatable to Victorian juries than the alternative, that a young woman could be an active, willing participant in mass infanticide. The assumption that women, especially young women, were naturally maternal and gentle made it difficult for contemporaries to accept that Polly could be equally guilty. She was sentenced to hard labor rather than death, served several years, and upon release disappeared from historical record. Whether she felt remorse, whether she rebuilt any kind of life, whether she was haunted by the babies she had helped her mother kill, none of this is known. She became one of history's minor characters, someone whose choices enabled horror, but who was not held fully accountable, possibly because the system could not conceive of female evil on the scale her mother represented and needed to believe that Polly was more victim than perpetrator. This same pattern would repeat in later cases involving female serial killers and their accomplices, a reluctance to acknowledge that women can be as calculating, as violent, and as capable of sustained cruelty as men, and a tendency to seek explanations in male influence, mental illness, or victimization, rather than accepting agency and culpability. The historiography of Amelia Dyer has evolved considerably since her execution in 1896. Contemporary accounts portrayed her as a uniquely depraved monster, an aberration in civilized society whose crimes could be understood only as manifestations of individual evil. Newspapers described her in terms that emphasized her abnormality, her difference from respectable women, her status as something other than fully human. This framing served a purpose for Victorian society. It allowed the public to be horrified by her crimes without examining too closely the social structures that had enabled those crimes for 3 decades. If Dyer was simply a monster, then her elimination through execution solved the problem. There was no need to question why so many women were desperate enough to hand their babies to strangers, why illegitimacy carried such devastating consequences, why the system had no safeguards to protect vulnerable children, or why complaints and suspicions had been ignored for so long. The monster narrative was comforting because it located evil in an individual rather than in a society. By the mid-20th century, as social histories began examining Victorian institutions more critically, interpretations of Dyer shifted. Historians like Lionel Rose, whose book The Massacre of the Innocents examined child murder in 19th-century Britain, contextualized Dyer within the broader phenomenon of baby farming and infanticide. These scholars argued that Dyer was not an anomaly, but an extreme example of exploitation that pervaded Victorian society. They documented how economic desperation, legal inequality, and moral hypocrisy created conditions where women's reproductive capacity was simultaneously policed and punished. Dyer became a symbol not just of individual criminality, but of systemic failure. Evidence that Victorian claims to moral superiority and progress concealed brutal realities for those outside the privileged classes. Contemporary feminist historians have further complicated the narrative by examining Dyer through the lens of gender and power. They argue that baby farming, including its murderous variants, was a distorted response to women's lack of reproductive autonomy and economic independence. Women like Dyer operated in spaces created by patriarchal structures that gave them no legitimate power but offered opportunities for illegitimate power through exploitation of even more vulnerable women. The relationship between Dyer and the mothers who gave her children was not simply predator and prey, but a complex dynamic shaped by shared gender oppression and different degrees of desperation. The mothers were victims of a society that punished them for sexuality outside marriage. Dyer was a product of that same society who found a way to profit from others' victimization. This analysis does not excuse her crimes, but situates them within systems of oppression that harmed all women while allowing some, like Dyer, to become perpetrators as well as victims. Some scholars argue that focusing exclusively on Dyer's monstrosity obscures the more mundane violence of legal and social systems that forced mothers into impossible choices. The 400 babies she murdered are horrifying, but how many other babies died in workhouses, were abandoned in streets, or were killed by mothers driven to desperate acts by the same lack of options? Dyer's crimes were exceptional in scale, but not fundamentally different in kind from the structural violence Victorian society inflicted on illegitimate children as a matter of course. This perspective challenges simplistic narratives of good and evil, asking instead how societies create conditions where such evil becomes not only possible, but profitable and sustainable for decades. The debate over whether Amelia Dyer was insane continues among psychologists and criminologists. Her defense team argued she suffered from puerperal mania, a form of mental illness associated with childbirth, though the connection to her crimes was tenuous since the killings occurred decades after her own childbearing years. Modern psychiatric assessment based on historical records suggests she may have met criteria for antisocial personality disorder, characterized by lack of empathy, disregard for social norms, manipulative behavior, and absence of remorse. However, diagnosing historical figures based on fragmentary records is inherently problematic. What is clear is that Dyer was capable of functioning in society, maintaining relationships, presenting a convincing, respectable facade, and operating a complex criminal enterprise for 3 decades. She was not psychotic, not detached from reality, not incapable of understanding right from wrong. She knew what she was doing, knew it was illegal and immoral, and chose to continue because it was profitable and because she believed she could avoid consequences. Whether this calculation represents mental illness or simply extreme criminality depends on how one defines those terms. The question matters because it speaks to culpability and prevention. If Dyer was insane, then her crimes were symptoms of illness that might have been treated or prevented through medical intervention. If she was simply criminal, then her crimes reflect choices made by someone with full moral agency, and prevention requires not medical treatment, but social structures that make such choices unprofitable or impossible. The Victorian court rejected the insanity defense, and most modern scholars agree with that assessment, recognizing that medicalization of her crimes would minimize both her responsibility and the systemic factors that enabled her. The physical traces of Amelia Dyer's crimes have largely disappeared. The house on Pigott's Road in Reading where she was arrested no longer exists, demolished decades ago and replaced by modern construction. The sections of the Thames where she disposed of bodies continue to flow, carrying no visible evidence of what was once deposited there. Newgate Prison, where she was hanged, was demolished in 1902. No grave marks her burial site within the prison grounds, and the exact location was lost when the Old Bailey was built over the prison footprint. The babies she murdered have no memorials, no graves, no markers. Most were never identified by name. They exist in historical record only as numbers, as evidence exhibits, as statistics in studies of Victorian crime. This physical erasure mirrors their social erasure. They were illegitimate, unwanted, disposed of, and now even their deaths are remembered primarily as context for their killer's story. Efforts to memorialize Victorian infanticide victims have been minimal. There are no plaques, no museums, no public acknowledgement of the scale of death that baby farming produced. This absence is not accidental. Acknowledging these deaths would require acknowledging the social systems that caused them, the complicity of respectable society in creating conditions where such deaths became routine, and the uncomfortable continuities between Victorian attitudes toward illegitimate children and modern attitudes toward certain categories of vulnerable lives. It is easier to remember Amelia Dyer as an individual monster than to remember the 400 babies as systemic victims, because the former requires only horror while the latter requires reflection on how societies decide whose lives matter and whose deaths can be ignored. The legal and social reforms that followed Amelia Dyer's execution were significant but incomplete. The Infant Life Protection Act of 1897 expanded registration and inspection requirements for anyone caring for children for payment, making it more difficult to operate unregistered baby farms. The Midwives Act of 1902 regulated midwifery, reducing opportunities for illegal adoptions to be facilitated through birth attendants. The Notification of Births Act of 1907 required all births to be reported to local authorities within 36 hours, creating a paper trail that made it harder for babies to simply disappear. The Adoption of Children Act of 1926 finally created a legal framework for adoption, requiring court approval and background checks. These reforms collectively made baby farming as Dyer had practiced it much more difficult. However, they did not address the underlying social conditions that created demand for such services. Illegitimacy remained heavily stigmatized until well into the 20th century. Unmarried mothers continued to face employment discrimination, social ostracism, and economic hardship. The mother and baby homes that operated in Britain, Ireland, and other countries from the 1920s through the 1990s, while not sites of mass murder like Dyer's operations, were often coercive institutions where unmarried mothers were pressured or forced to give up their children for adoption. The last of these homes did not close until 1998. The Magdalen Laundries in Ireland, institutions where women deemed morally compromised, were sent for forced labor, operated until 1996. The social impulse to punish and control women's sexuality and reproduction, the impulse that created the conditions for Amelia Dyer's crimes, persisted in modified forms for over a century after her death. Reform addressed symptoms, but was far slower to address causes. The question of how Amelia Dyer is remembered today reveals interesting patterns in collective memory. She is largely unknown to the general public. Unlike Jack the Ripper, whose murders occurred only a few years before Dyer's arrest, and who killed far fewer people, Dyer has not become a cultural icon. There are no tours of her murder sites, no popular books or films dramatizing her crimes, no enduring fascination with her psychology or methods. This relative obscurity is partly because her crimes lack the dramatic elements that make for compelling popular narratives. She did not stalk victims through foggy streets. She did not leave cryptic messages or taunt police. She did not have a distinctive modus operandi beyond simple strangulation. Her victims were babies, which makes the crimes disturbing in ways that do not translate well to entertainment. And perhaps most significantly, her crimes force confrontation with uncomfortable truths about social structures and collective responsibility, while Jack the Ripper can be framed as a lone madman whose evil was entirely individual. Dyer's story implicates not just her, but the mothers who gave her children, the authorities who ignored warnings, the neighbors who saw but said nothing, the social system that created desperate mothers and disposable babies, and by extension, the audience who must acknowledge that their ancestors likely supported or at least tolerated the conditions that made her crimes possible. This complexity makes her less suitable for the simplified narratives that popular culture prefers. Where she is remembered, it is primarily in academic contexts, in histories of crime and social reform, and increasingly in discussions about reproductive rights and women's autonomy. Her name surfaces in debates about abortion, about support for single mothers, about adoption practices, invoked as historical evidence of what happens when societies punish women for reproduction outside approved contexts. The mothers who survived Amelia Dyer, who gave her their babies and later learned those babies had been murdered, deserve particular consideration in how this history is understood and remembered. These women made choices under conditions of extreme constraint. They were not naive or stupid. Most suspected that handing a baby to a stranger for a one-time payment might not result in the idyllic adoption scenario Dyer described. But the alternatives were so grim that even a small hope that the baby might survive and thrive was worth clinging to. Some mothers chose Dyer over infanticide, over abandoning babies in streets or on doorsteps, over the workhouse where infant mortality rates approached 70% in some facilities. From their perspective, paying someone who claimed to offer adoption was the best available option, the choice most likely to give their child some chance at life. They were wrong, tragically wrong, but their wrongness was shaped by a society that gave them no good choices. Judging them for making bad choices from a range of only bad choices is both morally simplistic and historically irresponsible. They deserve recognition not as accomplices or enablers, but as victims of the same system that produced Amelia Dyer. Women trapped between biology and social structures, doing what they believed they must to survive, and hoping desperately that somehow their children might survive too. That many of them carried guilt, grief, and trauma for the rest of their lives is documented in the fragmentary records that remain. That they received no support, no acknowledgement, no justice beyond the execution of the woman who killed their children is an additional cruelty the historical record should acknowledge. The parallels between Amelia Dyer's era and contemporary issues are uncomfortable but undeniable. Today, debates rage over reproductive rights, access to abortion, support for single parents, adoption practices, and the value placed on different categories of children's lives. The specific circumstances have changed, but underlying tensions remain. Societies still struggle to balance moral judgments about reproduction with practical realities of supporting children. Economic pressures still push women toward impossible choices about whether and how to parent. Stigma, though reduced, still attaches to certain kinds of reproduction, certain kinds of families, certain kinds of mothers. The impulse to regulate women's bodies, to punish deviation from reproductive norms, persists in modified forms. Amelia Dyer operated in a world where illegitimate babies were socially worthless and where desperate mothers had no recourse. That world no longer exists in most developed nations, but echoes remain. The question her story poses is not whether individuals like her might emerge again, but whether societies continue to create conditions where vulnerable populations lack protection and where exploitation can operate with minimal oversight. The answer, disturbingly, is yes. Human trafficking, exploitation of migrant women and children, abuse within unregulated care systems, all demonstrate that structural vulnerabilities persist and that predators continue to identify and exploit them. The forms change, the technologies evolve, but the fundamental dynamic of power-exploiting powerlessness remains depressingly constant. Standing in Reading today, on streets that have been rebuilt and renamed multiple times since the 1890s, there is nothing to indicate that this was once the centre of Britain's worst serial murder case. The Thames flows past, its waters having carried away evidence and bodies over a century ago. The houses where Amelia Dyer lived and killed are gone, replaced by modern buildings housing people entirely unaware of the history beneath their feet. This physical erasure is complete, but the historical and moral questions remain unresolved. 400 babies died because one woman decided their lives were worth less than the money she could extract from their mothers, and because a society created conditions where that decision could be implemented repeatedly for 3 decades with minimal interference. Amelia Dyer was executed, and the immediate horror was addressed through legal reforms, but the deeper questions about how societies value lives, about who is protected and who is expendable, about what happens when economic desperation meets moral judgment, those questions were not fully answered then and remain unanswered now. The babies Amelia Dyer murdered cannot be brought back. Their names, most of them, are lost. Their graves, most of them, do not exist. But their deaths can still speak, if we are willing to listen, not just about one woman's evil, but about systems that enable evil, about collective failures that allow individuals to do terrible things, and about the responsibility each generation has to ensure that vulnerability is met with protection rather than exploitation. Amelia Dyer died on the scaffold in 1896, but the world that created her, that made her crimes possible and profitable, took much longer to die, and in some ways has never entirely disappeared. That is the uncomfortable truth her story tells, the lesson that transcends the horror of 400 small bodies wrapped and discarded, the warning that resonates across the century and more since her execution. We like to believe we are different, better, more enlightened, but the mechanisms that enabled Amelia Dyer, the stigma, the desperation, the indifference, the bureaucratic blindness, the willingness to look away as long as the problem disappears quietly, those mechanisms are not artifacts of Victorian barbarism. They are human tendencies that require constant vigilance to resist. Amelia Dyer is dead. The babies she killed are dead. But the choice between seeing vulnerable lives as worthy of protection or as inconvenient problems to be eliminated remains very much alive.